Today in our sermon series on God's Big Story, we reach number 14, and it's called the Problems Continue, Sin and Forgiveness. And the Bible text it's taken from is from John's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, or I could have used the prodigal son too. Jesus went across to Mount Olives, but he was soon back in the temple again. Swarms of people came to him. He sat down and taught them. The religion scholars and Pharisees led in a woman who'd been caught in an act of adultery. They stood her in plain sight of everyone and said, "Teacher, this woman was caught red-handed in the act of adultery. Moses in the law gives orders to stone such persons. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something incriminating so they could bring charges against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger in the dirt. They kept at him, badgering him. He straightened up and said, "The sinless one among you, go first. Throw the stone." Bending down again, he wrote some more in the dirt. Hearing that, they walked away one after another, beginning with the oldest. The woman was left alone. Jesus stood up and spoke to her. "Woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you?" "No one, Master." "Neither do I," said Jesus. "Go on your way. From now on, don't sin." Two little boys had fallen out when they were playing one day, but the next morning Jake took his football and he headed for Toby's house again. Surprised, an older member of the family said teasingly, "What, are you going to play with him again? I thought you'd quarrelled last night, and that you were never going to have anything to do with each other ever again. Funny memory you have." Jake looked a bit sheepish and then said, "Oh, Toby and me are good forgetters." Children often do seem to be good forgetters and forgivers. It's adults that sometimes have the trouble. C.S. Lewis made this telling remark: "Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive." There are lots of examples of forgiveness in the Bible. Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. St. Paul, "Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another," to name just a couple of them. The ultimate one, of course, is Jesus on the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And as he said those words, no one seemed very sorry. The crowd laughed and mocked and cheered and jeered at him. In some ways, it's easier to say what forgiveness isn't than what it actually is. Forgiveness doesn't mean that you have to pretend that horrendous things never took place. It doesn't mean making excuses for other people's bad behaviour. It doesn't mean denying that others tried to hurt you repeatedly or pretending that you were never hurt. It doesn't mean that you must restore the relationship to exactly the same state that it was in before. And it doesn't mean that all negative consequences of sin are cancelled. When 18-year-old Anthony Walker, a committed Christian and youth leader, was savagely murdered in an unprovoked racist attack in Liverpool, his mum G forgave the two boys who killed him, but they still had to face the consequences of what they'd done and received a life sentence. One day, Peter asked Jesus, "How many times should we forgive someone who sins against us?" And Jesus told him, 70 times 7. That's 490 times. That's a lot of sin and a lot of pain, and that's a whole lot of forgiveness. It seems impossible and definitely impractical, but that's what Jesus said. Jesus told many stories about forgiveness, one of which we've heard this morning. In the parable of the lost son, the key to interpretation for Christians is that the forgiving Father represents God. The lost son represents all people or sinners, and the older brother represents people who've already have relationships with God. The story reminds us of God's overwhelming desire for humans to return to him, whatever they've done, and the forgiveness that is on offer. The story of the lost son exemplifies that Jesus is also very critical of those who think they have things sorted because of their careful adherence to the law. Acting correctly in terms of ritual practice didn't impress the prophet Amos, and Jesus, continuing the role of prophet, often reminds his listeners that actions need to come out of a genuine attitude of love, like we spoke about last time. The way that sin can distort people's thinking and relationships is illustrated by the woman caught in adultery. It highlights how quick humans can be to judge and condemn others. God's big story sees sin as a central problem in the relationship between human beings and between humans and God. Christians may want to follow God and keep his commands, but they often talk about the difficulty of doing this, the tendency to go their own way. However, Christians also talk about God's desire to win people back and forgive them. In the New Testament, many Christians see Jesus as embodying the loving attitude of God to those who recognise their sinful state and turn to him. Forgiveness isn't an optional part of the Christian life. It's a necessary part of what it means to be a Christian. If we're going to follow Jesus, we must forgive. We have no other choice. And we must forgive as God has forgiven us, freely, completely, graciously, and totally. The best incentive to forgiveness is to remember how much God has already forgiven you. The Victorian poet Elizabeth Barrett's father disapproved of her marriage to Robert Browning so strongly that he never forgave her. She wrote letters to her father seeking reconciliation, but he returned them unopened. Had he opened them and read the beautiful language she used, he may have forgiven her. The Bible is God's letter to give us reconciliation, so let's look to its teaching and follow it the best way that we can.